What if I told you that the calm, meditative, philosophical Buddha you see everywhere isn't ancient at all? What if he was actually invented in 19th century Europe? Welcome to Insight Inferno. In this episode, we are diving deep into a fascinating historical detective story, exploring the work of Professor Donald Lopez from his lecture at Yale University, Building a Better Buddha.
So yeah, that's the big question we're tackling today. We're going on a journey to uncover how the Western world first encountered, completely misunderstood, and then ultimately totally reimagined one of the most iconic figures in all of history. And it's a story that, honestly, tells us just as much about ourselves as it does about the Buddha.
Okay, so let's hop in the time machine and go way back. Before the 1800s, when the first European travelers and missionaries started showing up in Asia, they didn't find a religion they could neatly label Buddhism. Nope. What they found was this bewildering collection of local statues, rituals, and stories that they just could not make sense of.
Take a guy like Marco Polo, right? In the 13th century, he's in Sri Lanka, and he hears about a figure he calls Sagamuni Borkon, which is just a mangled version of Shakyamuni Buddha. But he didn't see the founder of a global philosophy. To him, this was just some local saint, the very first guy that people started making idols of. He saw one piece of a puzzle he had no idea how to solve. Fast forward a couple of centuries, and the view gets, well, a lot more hostile. You've got the famous Jesuit missionary Francis Xavier in Japan. He hears about figures named Zaka and Amida, and his conclusion? These weren't real historical people. They were, in his words, pure inventions of the demons sent to trick people. This wasn't a cultural exchange, it was straight-up spiritual warfare.
And for centuries, this was the story, just complete confusion. Europeans kept running into these figures with all these different names in different countries: Borkan in Sri Lanka, Zaka in Japan, Pho in China, Buddhism in Ceylon. They were all clues to the same person, but nobody could connect the dots. The theories got pretty wild, too. One scholar even came up with the African hypothesis, suggesting the Buddha must have been an Egyptian priest because the statues had curly hair.
So the big takeaway here is that for hundreds of years, the Buddha was completely lost in translation. To the European mind, he wasn't a single historical person. He was this messy jumble of idols, demons, and saints, all seen through a lens of total and profound misunderstanding.
But then, the 19th century rolls around, and everything changes. A brand new image of the Buddha was about to be forged not in a temple in Asia, but in the quiet halls of European universities.
The shift was absolutely dramatic. I mean, look at this. The perception of the Buddha went from a collection of superstitious idols to a deep philosopher, from a confusing mess of local gods to the founder of a major world religion. So, how in the world did that happen?
The key was a brand new field of study, philology, basically the science of language and texts. For the first time ever, European scholars could get their hands on ancient Buddhist manuscripts and read them in their original languages, like Sanskrit, and they made a huge decision. They decided to build a real Buddha, not from the messy living traditions they saw, but from these ancient texts, which they figured must hold the pure original truth.
And the chief architect of this new Buddha was a French scholar named Eugène Burnouf. In his huge 1844 book, he painted the picture that's so familiar to us now, a noble prince who gives it all up to become a wandering monk and a profound moral teacher. Burnouf's Buddha was rational, he was human, he was saintly. He was a philosopher, not a god.
And this is what Professor Lopez calls the scientific Buddha. This is the Buddha that so many of us in the West think of today. He's a historical figure, a deep thinker, an ethical guide. But, and this is so important, he's been completely stripped of all the fantastic, supernatural, and so-called superstitious stuff that those early travelers just couldn't wrap their heads around.
Now, there was another layer to this, and it's a pretty complicated one. It's about race. Through philology, these scholars discovered that Sanskrit was related to European languages. This led to a theory that the Buddha himself was an Aryan, a noble ancient relative of Europeans. And just like that, he wasn't some strange foreign idol anymore. He was one of us. And that made his philosophy so much easier for 19th century Europe to accept and embrace.
So, these European scholars built this perfectly rational, human, relatable Buddha, all based on the ancient texts. Case closed, right? Well, here's the twist. What kind of Buddha do those texts, the sutras, the sacred scriptures of Buddhism, actually describe?
This is where the story gets really wild. because the Buddha you find in the scriptures is a very different being from the scientific one constructed in Europe.
So, forget the simple human teacher for a second. The texts say the Buddha's body had 32 special marks of a Superman. And these are not subtle things. We're talking about having 40 perfectly white teeth, webbed fingers and toes, arms so long he could touch his knees without even bending over, and a tongue so long he could lick his own ears. This is not a normal human body.
And it gets even more cosmic. According to the sutras, when the Buddha smiles, it's not just a smile. It's a full-on cosmic event. Multicolored rays of light literally shoot out of his mouth, travel across the entire universe, ease the suffering in all the hells, and then return to his body to signal a prophecy about the future. This is a universe-altering event.
And what about his mind? Well, it's described as completely, totally omniscient. He knows every single one of his past lives and the past lives of every other being in the entire cosmos. He knows everything happening everywhere right now in the present. And he knows everything that will ever happen in the future. This is not just a wise man. This is a being with a godlike, all-knowing mind.
So we're left with two very, very different Buddhas. We have the rational human teacher built in the 19th century, and we have the cosmic, superpowered being from the ancient scriptures. And this brings up a really fundamental question. What's the source of their authority?
And here's the real difference, right here. The traditional Buddha, the Buddha of the sutras, his authority comes from continuity. He wasn't some great inventor. He simply rediscovered an eternal, timeless truth that had been known and taught by countless other Buddhas before him. But the modern, scientific Buddha, his authority comes from originality. He's seen as a kind of spiritual scientist who was the first to discover the truth, all on his own.
So, what this all means is that the image of the Buddha that's so common in the world today isn't some timeless ancient truth. It's a profound reinterpretation. It's an invention, born in a very specific time and place, 19th century Europe with all of its own scientific, cultural, and even racial biases.
Which leaves us with one final and kind of provocative question. What would the cosmic, all-knowing Buddha from the traditional texts, what would he think about this modern, rational, purely human version of himself?
Well, a text from the ancient Pali Canon gives us a pretty direct and honestly a pretty chilling answer. The Buddha himself is quoted as saying that anyone who claims his teaching is merely hammered out by reasoning, the work of a rational philosopher, is headed straight for hell unless they take it back. It's a powerful and deeply ironic final thought on the huge, huge gap between an ancient faith and its modern scientific reinvention.